Això, i que no troba manera de fixar ni del PSC ni de...
Bueno, ja dic, no, jo voto el PSC, perquè diu que vol intentar sumar aquests noms. Algo així. Però bueno, ara ja estarà,
No sé, ara...
Has de parlar amb mi?
Senyor vicepresident, si pot prendre un moment. Vostè té un conegut meu, que coneix una persona molt propa al meu cor. El Gerard Gómez és el meu cosí, el diputat d'Esquerra. Primo hermano, així que sí.
Parlament ens veiem.
Seguim, a través d'ell estic seguint molt a prop tot el que està passant. Molt bona sort. Molt bona sort a tothom.
I llavors aquí t'havies d'estudiar aquí o...?
Sí. Tenia classe als Estats Units, vaig educar als Estats Units, per això quan sentes parlar anglès si fan preguntes i fes una pregunta, però no tinc accent perquè em vaig educar allà i tinc doble nacionalitat, la dona és perquè ella fa de canguru dels meus tres nens i no... Estava als Estats Units i jo volem estar més a prop de la família a Catalunya, va ser una mica, no sé, decepcionant trobar la feina aquí, però també decepcionant perquè també havia sol·licitat una plaça permanent a l'AUB, però al mateix temps el sou que hi ha al mentor universitari espanyol.
Sí, està fatal. És una gran però si no vaig seguir fent coses a la universitat.
Sí, ja. Se'n paguen.
No, parlem per la competitivitat respecte a los italians.
Fins i tot potser menys. Tens menys aquí que hagués fet a Barcelona. Em paguen 15.000 euros.
És pasta.
No es podia viure. Vaig mirar els números i no es podia viure a Barcelona. Amb el sou que oferia.
No. S'està fent bastant però veiem què passarà amb les municipals. De fet, jo vaig estar la setmana passada, la setmaneta, que vaig passar per Caio de Vilanova i dels sots a Vic. O sigui, vaig passar dues per això. I vaig aprofitar i vaig tenir oportunitat de xerrar amb gent que estava una mica més ficada a la política allà, sobretot de fer un quadre de la Colau, de les Veres, i va ser interessant. I dius, hòstia, un té un discurs de laboral molt bé, però li falta la pragmàtica. I després poden ser molt fets que coses bones i coses que dius, bueno, si no la dia.
Niin, kello on sen verran, että voidaan aloittaa. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this lecture. My name is Sanne Riitakorpi. I am the Executive Director of the Finland Catalonia Friendship Association. Edustaa Suomen Catalonia ystävyysseuraa, joka järjestää tämän luennon. Welcome, there is many of you here, very nice, and also welcoming everyone following this through the live stream online from elsewhere in Finland and also especially in Catalonia. Bon dia tots amics i amigues a Catalonia. Welcome, we have an interesting topic here today, what's going on in Catalonia, about the political situation in Catalonia at the moment. We have, it's always interesting to speak to the players themselves, and we have a special guest here today, Mr. Josep Costa. He's the Vice President of the Catalan Parliament. You can also say Deputy Speaker of the Catalan Parliament. He's a lawyer as well as a professor of political science, and he has specialized in the right to self-determination as well as theories on succession. He's very recent in Catalan politics, elected to the Catalan Parliament in December 2017, and elected right away as the first Vice President. Welcome here, and thank you for taking part in this. After this introduction, I will give the floor to the Vice President. He will talk about the situation in Catalonia and Professor Teivo Teivainen from the University of Helsinki will join us later for a dialogue with Mr. Costa, and of course there is plenty of time for questions from the audience. Without further ado, Mr. Vice President, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Janet. Gracias. Buen día. Good morning. I'm very pleased to be here, and it's not the first time, but it's still new for me to be as a politician in the classroom, and I still don't know if I will be speaking more like a professor or more like a politician. So you take the side that you prefer. Maybe some of your questions will be more from a perspective of a student, and some of you will be more like interested citizens that are interested in politics. So coming from this background, obviously of a political scientist and a lawyer, and someone who's written and published my work on the issue of self-determination and secession a long time ago. I remember that 20 years ago I spent some time in Canada and Quebec studying the 95 referendum in Quebec, and I published a paper more than 15 years ago on theories of secession, and it's a new perspective to be in politics in the middle of a process of self-determination like the one in Catalonia today. So I think an interesting way to start this presentation is to put forward to present both sides of what's going on in Catalonia, the purely political side of it, and the more academic vision, or the more academic analysis. I think that on the political side, we could define what's going on in Catalonia. Obviously, is a self-determination process that is motivated, or it's caused by a constitutional crisis. So this is not something new. But I think that the same events that are happening in Catalonia could be framed in a more academic analysis as a crisis of the social contract, if I may say it this way. So it's a break of the relationship between the political institutions and the people, which in a democracy should be based on consent or on democratic legitimacy. So we have a political crisis, a constitutional crisis, that in academic terms should be framed, I would argue, as a crisis of the social contract, as a crisis of legitimacy. You all know, I guess, I should not spend a lot of time explaining what happened in Catalonia in recent years, but I think you can go as further back as you want. You find instances, you find examples of why Catalonia is not part of Spain in a normal manner, in a normal relationship. So there's always something wrong with Catalonia being part of Spain. There's always some problematic there's something problematic about this relationship. You can go 300 years ago with a war of succession and the fall of Barcelona in 1714, etc. This is all quite well known. You can go 150 years ago when the Spanish government was bombing Barcelona to quash popular revolts, when there were revolutionary movements like the First Republic in Spain that was led by Catalans trying to change Spain into a federal system that obviously failed, and the Catalan leaders were basically killed or had to go to exile. And then obviously the Second Republic, the Civil War, the transition to democracy in 1978. So there's many examples throughout history that point out to to a situation of Catalonia not being part of Spain as part of a consensual agreement or a constitution that has been mutually agreed and respected. So the constitutional crisis is not something that began yesterday. It can go back in history as long as you want almost. But basically, the last events began in 2010 when the Constitutional Court struck down the Statute of Autonomy that was voted by the people in 2006 and basically broke the relationship between the will of the people and the legal framework. And that, from the point of view of political science, is a huge problem. The idea that a state, a constitutional system, can be based only on the written laws, only on the exercise of legal power, on the exercise of legal coercion, is just a nonsense. No political system, no system of government can be sustained on law alone. And by the way, this is not something that I'm making up. This is a sentence that I took from the decision of the Canadian Supreme Court on the issue of Quebec secession, that basically said this, that no system of government can be based on laws alone. That it needs the consent of the people, it needs democratic legitimacy to survive. And that's exactly the problem in Catalonia. That's exactly what's going on in Catalonia today. That obviously the people did not accept the ruling of the Constitutional Court of Spain against the Catalan Statute of Autonomy, and that was the beginning of this push for independence, which is still ongoing. Obviously, the reaction goes far beyond those who are for independence. I always like to remind that more than 85% of the members of the Catalan Parliament voted a resolution against the decision of the Constitutional Court to overrule the Catalan Statute of Autonomy. So it was a very broad consensus against the decision of the Constitutional Court to basically cut the powers of the Catalan government and Catalan Parliament. So basically, that led to a social movement that then became a political movement to seek a referendum on independence, a referendum on self-determination, which obviously was not accepted by the Spanish institutions, and that created the constitution, that aggravated, the constitutional crisis that we face today. Obviously, the Spanish approach to this is that the Constitution does not allow a referendum, the law does not permit to have a negotiation about the referendum, Spanish sovereignty is indivisible, and all these arguments that are very well known. The problem here is that Spain is not behaving like a democratic country would behave in such situations. And I already mentioned the Canadian answer to this, which was effectively the same, in the sense, at the beginning, it was the first premise was the same. The Canadian Constitution does not allow Quebec to secede. So there we have a constitutional problem. That was the first premise was the same in the case of Canada and the case of Spain. But the answer in the Canadian case was, well, then if that is the will of the province of Quebec, if the majority of Quebec want to secede, then the Constitution should be changed to make it possible. That was the strange response by the Canadians. And obviously the Spanish response was, if a majority of the Catalan people want to secede, they want to leave Spain, then no, it's not possible. And that answer is obviously a non-democratic answer, because if you don't have the consent of the people to rule, if you don't have the consent of the governed over the government, then you're not a democracy. And that's, in theory, that's the end of it. Right? If you want to be a democracy, you need democratic consent by the governed. Obviously, and I now turn to the more academic analysis of this, what's going on in Catalonia and Spain is an obvious breach of the social contract. Right? We always understood in modern times that the only legitimate government over our lives, over our destiny, is a government that we consent to have. Because we are all born free and equal. That's the starting point of modern political theory. So when you break the relationship between the institutions and the people, then you have the breach of the social contract. When you have a government, a system of government that does not respect the will of the people, you don't have a proper social contract. I know that social contract is something hypothetical, is something that is not really practical. It's not that all people in all countries actually consented to have their governments, but in theory that's the only way of saying that a government is democratic. Consent has to be actual, or has to be potential, or has to be theoretical, but what doesn't work is when the lack of consent is explicit, sustained, and as strong as it is in Catalonia, that a majority of the people openly reject to be ruled by some institutions and some laws that they have not consented. In that situation, it's obvious that we don't have a democratic system of government. And that's the broader framework of what's going on in Catalonia and Spain. How do you get out of this situation? Obviously, the people can, at some point, obviously, change their mind and decide they no longer want to change the constitutional framework, and they more or less accept that the system of government is the only possible system of government, and they give up on their idea, or they demand to change it. But obviously, that is very problematic, and it is relatively unlikely that it will happen. People don't often give up on the idea of democracy, don't often give up on the idea that they are the masters of their own destiny. So, what are the likely solutions to this, or the likely reactions, to a constitutional crisis, to a crisis of a social contract like this? I only see, obviously, I say the first one is unlikely. The first one would be that people just give up and say, okay, there's nothing we can do, let's move on, let's forget about politics, let's concentrate on different areas of life, and maybe the future will be better off. But I said that that's unlikely. Then you have basically two other options, two other political outcomes of this, of a crisis like this, of a crisis of the social contract, of a constitutional crisis. The first one is, in academic terms, could define it as the revolutionary solution. Obviously, if the people do not consent to be governed by the existing institutions, they are likely to revolt, they are likely to try to overthrow the existing political regime and build a new one. In the case of a territory that wants to separate, that wants to exercise self-determination and wants to build a new state, obviously that kind of revolutionary solution is secession. Right? So it's build a new state in a smaller territory that's separated from the existing state. So secession, almost by definition, is a revolutionary solution. And obviously, there are many cases of secession that are not revolutionary, but in academic terms, I would prefer not to talk about secession in that case. So when two parts of an existing country decide to separate, so they agree to separate, like, for example, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the former Czechoslovakia, when they decided to split, that was not a real secession because both sides agreed to separate. So that's not a secession in academic terms. It's secession, I would say that it's a word that you should only use it when it's non-consensual. So it's the territory that separates from an existing state without the consent of the existing state. So that's the revolutionary solution, and there might be another solution that is not purely revolutionary, that is not the attempt to immediately change the system of government, but it's the reaction to refuse or to denounce the existing political system, but not necessarily breaking away from the existing system. So, and the typical reaction that that kind would be civil disobedience, right? So you don't consider the laws to be legitimate, so you disobey the laws. But you don't necessarily attempt to establish new laws. You don't necessarily attempt to establish a new system of government that's separate from the existing one, but you basically try to put the will of the people against the existing laws to force the state to change the laws or to accept that you no longer want to be governed by those laws. That's obviously there are many experiences of civil disobedience, and I think it's also a very successful means of social protest, of very effective means of rejection against the existing system of government. And it has been successful in many cases. And I don't mean, by the way, that the two solutions are incompatible. So there may be crises like the one between Catalonia and Spain that have reactions that combine both the civil disobedience and the revolutionary solutions. If you look at the the October 1st referendum in Catalonia, it can be framed in both ways. It can be framed as a revolutionary solution, as a revolutionary breakaway from the existing state, or it can be read as civil disobedience, as an act of civil disobedience against the existing state. And since, for example, recent weeks, you probably know that there's this trial going on in Madrid against the leaders of the Catalan pro-independence movement. Most of them in the courtroom, they have framed what they had led in October 2017 as an act of civil disobedience. And I think if you understand the relationship between the trial and the events of October 2017 as something that is that should be defined as civil disobedience, you understand why it is this trial may have really defining consequences for the future of Catalonia and its relationship with Spain. Obviously, the referendum held in October the 1st was an act of disobedience, and it put into conflict the will of the people and the existing laws. And it obviously deepened the constitutional crisis, it deepened the crisis in the social contract, because it basically created a scenario in which the state has a bad choice. And that choice is to have this trial, and whatever the outcome of the trial is bad for the Spanish institutions and for the Spanish government. And that's because the referendum was a success in terms of civil disobedience. When people, just to put it easily, a civil disobedience movement is successful whenever people act against the laws and the majority of the society don't think they should be punished. That creates a huge problem for the state and for the government. There is some movement, there is some decision, there is some act that's obviously against the existing law, it's obviously against the legal system, but people don't think it should be punished. People don't think the law is a fair law. People don't think this law should be imposed, but rather they think the law should be changed altogether. That's exactly the situation in which civil disobedience is a success. And then, in that scenario, the state is always there to lose something. The state may choose to lose its authority, right? If the state allows this act of civil disobedience to go without punishment, it will lose authority, it will lose power in the eyes of the people. Or it may choose to lose legitimacy. It may choose to lose the support of the people. And that's when the state decides to impose punishment to those who acted against the law. And that's exactly the choice that now in the Supreme Court of Madrid are facing. Whatever the outcome of this trial is bad for Spain. Whether they impose a 15, 20-year sentence on the Catalan leaders, or they decide to let them go and release the prisoners, both decisions are bad for the existing constitutional system, for the reasons I said. If they don't punish the Catalan leaders, then they lose authority, and obviously we will be more than happy that they are not punished, because we will be ready to do it again, right? To try again, to seek independence. If they don't punish us, then it's an incentive for us to go the same way, to try it again and to insist on self-determination and independence. But if they decide to send them to jail, then it's also bad, because the reaction of the people will be against the government and against the institutions, because largely 80% of the Catalan society do not think that the Catalan leaders should be in jail for the referendum. So that's why, in terms of civil disobedience, it can be said that the October the 1st referendum was a clear success, because it put the state in a situation of having to choose between authority and legitimacy, and a system of government needs both or it doesn't have a future. So here we are. We don't know really what will happen next, because we don't know in the end what will be the choice of the Spanish courts. And we don't know what's going to be the sentence that they will impose on the Catalan leaders. And obviously you might want to ask yourselves, there could be an intermediate solution. Maybe we can find a point where there's not the reaction against the authority of the state, or there's not the reaction of losing legitimacy. But the bad news is that no such point exists. And that's why, the reason why no such point exists is that the distance between the public opinion of Catalonia and the public opinion of Spain is at such a distance. Whatever a majority of Catalans might think is a reasonable decision would not be seen by the majority of Spaniards as a reasonable decision. So there is not a common ground to be found in the decision of the Spanish courts and the Spanish institutions. So in the end, if they wanted, even if they wanted to find a point where a decision is not to punish too much the Catalan leaders or let them go without punishment, if they try to find the fair punishment that people would accept, it simply does not exist. And that's why it's all so interesting, and it's all so uncertain as to what it will happen. But all scenarios have something in common, which is that Catalonia is governed by a system of laws that has never been consented to by a vast majority of Catalans, and there is no indication that this majority of Catalans are ready to give up their right to decide their own future, their right to be governed by laws that they have consented to, which is a right that all countries, all nations, all peoples have. So I think I could stop here and continue the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Let me introduce Professor Teivo Teivainen from the University of Helsinki. He's a professor of world politics and has followed the Catalan situation with great interest, and let you two have some dialogue before the questions from the audience.
Yes, welcome to Helsinki, our university, and apologies for coming late. I had a horrible morning. Just a couple of brief questions, because I'm sure there are people who have deeper questions here, and who also heard the first part. Since you mentioned I'm professor of world politics, perhaps a couple of reflections, unless you already made them, on how do you see the aim of transnationalization of the independence movement, like where the role of leaders in exile, the possibility of, for example, now a bit more recent news, like if Carles Puigdemont will present himself for the European Parliament, and in general, the response or lack of response by European states and European Union institutions. So has it been successful, or have you been disappointed with that? Second thing, about on the outcome, you mentioned different outcomes of the judicial process. I've heard some people speculating on how giving harsh sentences and then an amnesty would be one combination that some people are speculating on as one possible outcome. How do you see the political impact of that kind of outcome? And perhaps a third, more conceptual one, though with political implications as a political scientist. you may want to reflect on the concept of violence here. It's been very fascinating to follow how the concept of violence has been used in the Catalan, the whole debate, and by the Spanish state. Normally, political scientists think the sort of broader concepts of violence are associated with progressive movements, like the feminists talk about broader concepts, the peace movement has talked about broader concepts of violence. Some talk about symbolic violence, epistemic violence, structural violence, even Marxists and something. And now we have a situation where a state has been using a wider concept of violence in order to justify harsh disciplinary action against people who rebel against the state. So do you think the Spanish courts and the Spanish authorities more generally are buying into a wider concept of violence? Reading some Spanish newspapers, it's been fascinating to see, like, don't the Europeans understand that violence is not only the kind of limiting sense of violence, but there's also this broad sense of violence, and they sound like sort of post-structuralist social theorists from like radical left, which they supposedly are not. So I'd be curious about that conceptual move.
That's interesting. So about the international view of that, I think it's pretty obvious, like looking back, that most most international observers totally understood the real nature of the conflict after the October events. And I'll use one example. I gave a talk like this one in Stockholm 1 month before the referendum. And I basically explained it the same way, that this is a conflict between the will of the people and a legal system, and we don't have a democratic answer, but an authoritarian answer to the conflict. And the reaction that I got from some people in the audience, and particularly those that were more informed and more involved, was that either think that there was still room for negotiation, there was still room for political dialogue before there was a clash, a real political crisis, and if not, that was to blame on the Spanish government, and that we should definitely seek a change in the Spanish government so that a new government would be open to dialogue and negotiation. And obviously I couldn't disagree more about that analysis, but I just couldn't get anyone to believe me. They thought that the crisis was not severe enough, that it could not lead to a negotiation about something that would be clear different from independence. So there could be constitutional reform, some sort of fiscal agreement that would basically make the majority of Catalans happy and would be acceptable by a majority of Spanish people. And I, at the time, I already said the same that I said here, that there's no common ground. There's nothing that Spain can offer that is acceptable by a majority of Catalans, and the other way around. Because the breach of this relationship between the will of the people and the existing legal system was so deep. So effectively, I have many evidence that, a lot of evidence that after October, a lot of people understood, one, what was the approach of the Spanish institutions to the problem, and they understood also that the Catalan leaders and the Catalan independence movement were serious about independence. So I think many people, the vast majority of people, even informed observers abroad, didn't understand the depth of the problem before October the 1st. And now people understand that yes, Catalans who support independence are serious about independence, and yes, Spain is giving an answer to this, which is a non-democratic answer. And I'm not saying that Spain is not a democracy, I'm saying that this is a non-democratic way to deal with this problem. Obviously the first reaction was, the normal reaction is, okay, this is a serious problem. So on the day after the referendum in Catalonia, you had a statement by the European Commission, and I don't think what the press release in the end said was the right thing to say. But the fact that there was an immediate reaction on day 2, on the 2nd day of October, is basically proof that they understood that it was a real constitutional crisis. Obviously, the solution was to tell the Spanish government, okay, here is a big problem, and by the way, you Prime Minister of Spain, you are saying that this is an internal matter for you to deal with, so be it. You own this problem. That was the end of the statement by the European Commission, was to say to Mariano Rajoy, you own this problem, which I understood in diplomatic language to mean you better fix this, because we will hold you responsible for the consequences of this problem if you don't fix it. And I suppose that because he misled the European parliaments to believe that his solution was the best solution, they allowed him to get away with it. And the solution that was proposed by Spain was to have an election in Catalonia in December 2017, and the Spanish government told everyone that because the majority of Catalans didn't want independence after all, they would not vote for the same pro-independence parties, and a new pro-Spanish unity government would be the solution to this crisis. So that was the first Spanish reaction. Okay, we call an election, we're going to scare people to the polls. That's what they did. They tried to scare everyone to the polls to vote against independence, with the Catalan leaders in prison, in exile, etc. And they were convinced that pro-independence parties would lose the election. And then, obviously, you all know what happened. I ran for office for the first time in that election, and we won again, and we secured the same majority we had before. And then, on the very next day after the election, there was a very interesting statement by the German government saying, okay, Mr. Rajoy, your solution failed, because there is a pro-independence majority in the Catalan Parliament. So, what's your proposal now? And obviously there was not. And in the end, that was the reason why the Spanish government collapsed a few months later, because it was apparent to everyone inside and outside Spain that the right-wing government had no solution. And then the new government came. So then there was an opportunity for the thesis that a different government would deal with this differently, and that might be the solution. Then those people had their occasion to prove that point. And after several months, I mean, we knew it would fail. We knew that the new government would not be able to propose anything different anything that would be the solution. And that's because of the Spanish public opinion, and because it was a very weak government. And in that situation, if you're a weak government and you have a public opinion against, there's not much you can do. So basically, the point that we were making 2 years ago, that a different government would not be the solution, is essentially now proven. And I know for the Catalans, and for the Catalan public opinion, and for the Catalan voters who support independence, this seems like a long journey. But looking at this situation from abroad, I guess it's not such a long journey. The journey began on October the 1st, and people are just starting to realize that the real problem they identified in October 2017 does not find a solution through the normal recipes for these kind of problems. And so no, I'm not particularly disappointed about the response from the international community. It's the response to be expected. First, we don't know about the problem. We really don't understand what's going on. So our analysis is flawed in that sense. We don't really know what's going on. Then we understand what's going on. We propose the normal solutions, is dialogue, negotiation. Because this is a real problem. So we better deal with it through dialogue and political solutions. We know it's not going to work because we've tried this many, many times. But we need to show, we need the international community to realize by themselves that this is not going to work. And we now have a failed government that lasted only 8 months, and that's the shortest living government in Spain, in the history of Spain. And we have an election now, and a lot of people know, I think the majority of the observers are aware that this election will not be the solution, because the best outcome is to have the same weak government that's fearful of the public opinion be re-elected, or we can have a right-wing government that's strongly anti-Catalan, anti-independence. So we can have the same or worse. So I think many people will start to realize that we need international mediation, that we need foreign intervention, because there will not be a bilateral negotiation, a bilateral meaningful negotiation between the Catalan government and the Catalan and Spanish government. So we are in desperate need of international intervention, and the alternative is what I said before was the secession, the other solution, not the civil disobedience scenario that we have witnessed so far, but the outright secession. And that obviously a lot of international actors should understand that those are the only two options. There's either a negotiation which is not about concessions by the Catalan side, but by, it's about concessions by the Spanish side, or the only option we have left is unilateral secession. You said harsh sentences and amnesty. I think that it doesn't work, because you try to get both, but you get none. You try to get both, keeping the authority and keeping the legitimacy, but you get none. I think it's not. If people know in the very act of sentences being made public that there will be an amnesty, they will say, okay, so we're fine because there's an amnesty. If they so the reaction will be like a the opposite of a harsh sentence, like they were released without charges. And if there's a harsh sentence but there's no promise of an amnesty, people will have the same reaction. So I think some people may be thinking in that way. I don't think it's the solution. I don't think it's likely.
Okay, yeah, that was my
I
question.
don't think it's likely because you see, in the previous days before the collapse of the Spanish government and the announcement of the elections for April 28th, there was this big demonstration in Madrid that was called by 3 right-wing parties against the government. And it was not against an amnesty, it was just against the idea of having an independent rapporteur in the negotiating table. And that was, the reaction was so strong and it was so harsh on the government that basically the government had to step back and give up on the idea of a real negotiation before the demonstration. And I think that's the reason why the demonstration did not gather hundreds of thousands of people, but rather only several dozens of thousands, which is a huge demonstration anyway, but it was not so massive a demonstration because the government had given in already before the demonstration. So the announcement of the demonstration made the government give in. So can we imagine that how the same people would react in the event of an amnesty? People were some people, and not like fringe opinion leaders, but someone like the former foreign affairs minister. The former foreign affairs minister mentioned that the prime minister should be tried by the Congress according to an article that's that regulates the cases of treason. For that proposal to have an independent rapporteur on a negotiating table. Can you imagine what the proposal would be if he were to propose amnesty for the Catalan leaders after a harsh sentence? I can't imagine. And I know that a weak government will not resist the pressure and would not, in the end, even if promised, even if announced, it would not deliver an amnesty. And very interesting point about violence and how the concept is manipulated. And I think there's something very odd about the reaction of the Spanish judicial system, because it's all about putting the state officials, the state structures, and the state institutions in the position of the victim. So you read the decisions of the court, and there's a couple of instances in which the judge, in his reasoning, speaks as himself. He speaks of himself, as the victim of the crime. He uses the first, I don't know how to put it in English, but he speaks about us, right? And that's not, it may be a mistake that he writes down this expression, but it's exactly the way they're thinking. For example, they've been prosecuting people for hate crimes because they criticize the police. So, can anyone think of any other example of hate crimes that are against the powerful? I mean, hate crimes protect the vulnerable in the society, right? I mean, I take it for granted that if any such crimes exist in Finland are the same, they protect the vulnerable in the society. So how come the prosecutor is going after people who've been publishing tweets or Facebook messages against the police for hate crimes? It's because they put themselves in this position of victims. And it's bizarre that the state power, the state apparatus, is presenting itself as the victim in a situation in which there's only a social movement that's obviously against the state. It's obviously against the government. It's obviously against the law. But it's very strange to frame that as a victimization of the power structure, of the powerful. And it is, so it goes beyond the use of this misuse of the concept of violence. Is the fact that the power structures define themselves as the victims of a crime, when the only thing that's going on is people protesting against the powerful, against power structures. And I think that it's another example that something is deeply wrong about the Spanish judicial system and the Spanish elected authorities. And we always, I mean, we pro-independence Catalans always go back to the what we consider to be a failed transition to democracy, and the fact that unelected officials, particularly judges, basically didn't notice that there was a transition. They all kept their jobs. And as an anecdote, I mean, the most common biographical thing that judges of the Supreme Court have in common is to be relatives of former members of the Supreme Court. So it means that there is a clear continuation of the same families in the powerful positions between before and after democracy. And that's probably why that there was a judge the other day that issued a ridiculous decision stopping the removal of Franco's remains from the public worshipping place. He was the son of a former Francoist general. And that's the only explanation, because the decision is ridiculous in legal terms. But he's not the only judge that's the son of a former Francoist official. The majority of them are. And they feel threatened by, not only by the Catalan movement, they feel threatened by left-wing forces, left-wing governments, and it's difficult to understand, but that's what's going on. The fact that those who were in power for so long, that they kept their powerful positions after the transition to democracy, that they did not face any punishment for their crimes during the dictatorship. They are now, they now genuinely think of themselves as victims of something. I think that's an explanation of many things that are going on, but I don't really know how to deal with that. I don't really have an answer or a solution for that. I know I don't want to live in that kind of political system. That would be the long answer to the questions.
Do you want to add something or do? Then questions from, yes, we still have 30 minutes, so questions from the audience. You can.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for your lecture. It's very interesting. However, I am from Spain. I got to live many years in Catalonia and also in Madrid. And I think that there are some things that have been told here that are not completely true. First of all, you have presented the Spanish state as a totalitarian country. And I would like to say that due to the economy, Spain is one of the 20 food universities in the world. And also Freedom House gives a 95 out of 100 score for the political and civil liberties in Spain. So, of course, Spain is a democracy. What you said about the history of Catalonia, you presented it as a conflict between Spain and Catalonia. You started talking about the Secession War in 1714, and the fact is that it was Spain completely was divided into two sections. One that supported the French candidate and then an Austrian candidate. And in fact, the liberal candidate that we can understand as the French candidate to the throne was firstly, in first instance, Catalonia supported it. Sorry? Yeah, that one, yeah. And then, well, we can take a look to the history of Catalonia, how the aristocracy of Catalonia supported Miguel Primo de Rivera, that established a dictatorship in Spain. How then this aristocracy of Catalonia has been against the Spanish Second Republic, and then how they supported also Franco. And that's why Catalonia is a rich part of Spain right now, and not other parts of Andalusia or Castilla and Leon, for example. And then we can get to the 1978 when the Constitution was signed. And the reality is that 91.09% of Catalans supported the Constitution. So there was a wide consensus that this democracy was wanted from the Catalan people. And then we can arrive to today, where there were Catalan elections held, where 51% of the votes went for non-independentist parties. That, however, they have a very wide perspective of things, because we can find parties like the Popular Party, that is a right, hard right party, and also we have Podemos or Podem in Catalonia. They are like a far left party that have different opinions. You have the 155 article and these judgments that are happening right now. But overall, they are all against independency of Catalonia. Just 51% of the votes. And then just 47.6% of the votes went for independentist parties, such as Junts per Catalunya, Esquerra Republicana, or the HUP. And then, so it's not a conflict between Spain and Catalonia, it's mainly a conflict between Catalans, because there are different opinions, and that's represented in the parliament right now. Although it's true that in MPs, is it called in English? Yeah. It's true that they have the majority right now due to the electoral law, but it's just a small minority that, I mean, it's like absolute majority, but it's not like a wide majority, because we don't have the majority in the streets, in the people. There's also some lies that have been told about the negotiations with the government of Spain, because the reality is that there are legal mechanisms to change the constitution right now, and it's their decision that they didn't choose them. They can go to the parliament, the Spanish parliament, and convince 3/5 of the Camera to support a change in constitution, and they decided not to do, as he said, a revolution. So they denied democracy, a democratic procedure, and they decided to give this. We could understand it as a coup d'etat. And for example, we can have doubts about this procedure. For example, we think that the 1st of October referendum that was held in Catalonia, we still don't know how did they get the data of all the citizens, and they didn't have a legal safeness for the data. And they have been asked many times in Spanish television in debates, and they still haven't said how did they get them, if they were safe, if they were not. We still don't know. And suddenly they proclaimed a Catalan Republic due to that referendum, in which, for example, judges were going to be named by the President of the Republic, not by people, not by an independent institution. Just
Excuse me, can you conclude with a
Yeah.
question?
Sure.
Thank you.
So, one of the last things that I would like to say is that I think that they are not Catalan leaders, they are independentist leaders, because they have an opinion of what Catalonia has to be. It's a self-opinion that they have, and it's not shared by the majority of Catalonia. And, just said things that this last question, once like all these things have been clear. You have said, for example, that if leaders are released, you will do this again. So, in what position do you think that you leave all the independentist leaders that are being judged right now, if you're stating, you're affirming that you're going to do this again? And also, in the fire that you was put, yes, that's the first question.
I hope nobody's going to be punished by what I do.
Okay, and the second.
If this is such a brilliant democracy.
Okay, and the second point is that you also affirming the fire is that you declare secession, that in the judgments that I'm having now is that it wasn't declared, it was just a political statement that didn't have any effects. So those are the main questions, and once everything is clear, you can proceed with that. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think this is really an alternative conference. It's not really a question. And I respect your freedom of expression, and I really need to, just a couple of points that I explicitly, and because this is being broadcasted, maybe we can see the video, I explicitly said I'm not saying that Spain is not a democracy. I am saying that they are not giving the democratic answer to this conflict. So obviously, you said literally that I define Spain as a totalitarian system. This is obviously not true. And you can interpret or understand Spanish history the way you want. I just doesn't matter to the argument. I just explained that there is historically many conflicts that have this consequence of Spain not being able to find a stable political constitution. And you mentioned the idea of amending the constitution. You know, Spain in constitutional history is famous for being a country that has many more constitutions, different constitutions, than constitutional amendments. So there's something wrong with Spanish constitutional history. You have countries, the successful countries have one constitution and many amendments. And in Spain, you have many more constitutions than amendments, and it's because the difficulty to change constitutions is not. I'm not talking about today. I'm talking about 200 years of Spanish history. The difficulty that of the amendment systems of the Spanish constitutions have led constitutions to fail altogether before they have been able to be amended. And yes, there was a 91% vote in Spain, in Catalonia, for the Spanish constitution, and yes, there was 1981 coup d'etat that changed the interpretation and the development and the implementation of the Spanish constitution. And the coup d'etat in 1981 did not want to change or overthrow the constitution. They wanted to stop the devolution of powers to the regions, to the autonomous communities, and in that sense it was a successful coup d'etat because it changed the interpretation and the implementation of the constitutional provisions. And but anyway, I respect your point of view, but I modestly think they don't present any alternative solution to what I said. And I honestly believe that jailing people for their political views or their political decisions or their political acts is not the solution to any political problem. And again, you can frame the problem, you can discuss the causes, the origins of the problem, but we do have a constitutional crisis that is a crisis of the social contract, and that is because the majority of Catalans, and that's not only the pro-independence Catalans, you know it very well, the vast majority of Catalans would not vote in favor of the current Spanish constitution today. They support a referendum on independence, whether they agree or not with independence, and they think that it's wrong to have the Catalan leaders in prison. It's wrong to have, by the way, Catalan leaders, they are Catalan leaders, they have a government, and the Catalan government always had more popular support than any Spanish government. The current Spanish government had support of 25% of the Congress. So if that is a problem for Catalonia, it should be probably for Spain. And you, I suppose, you would never claim that the Spanish Prime Minister is not a Spanish leader. So overall, the denying the problem, denying a constitutional problem, denying a crisis of the social contract, I don't think is the solution for anything. I think to basically say that you get the votes, you get the majority to amend the constitution is the reason why, is the proposal that made all previous Spanish constitutions fail altogether. I think. Okay, but after him, it was you. I don't remember.
Okay. Well, he was told that outside mediators, they come in a conflict. We know that many conflicts, like Ireland, to put it aside, area, Northern Ireland, had outside mediators. Now, who do you think they can be? If the Europeans, not any European country in the EU, would it be somebody else? From Latin America, or from, because I think the Latin Americans will understood some, I'm not saying names of the country, but some can have a better, maybe, have a better understanding of the problem.
I think this is, the problem is not such a, an intractable problem that's never found elsewhere. I mean, it's a relatively familiar kind of conflict. And I I obviously would never name anyone to be a mediator because that would immediately disqualify him from doing that job. But I think that the only condition for a mediator is that he is truly independent and impartial. And that's there are no conditions on nationality or background, really.
Is independence only?
Sorry?
Independence only supposed? What about large self-government,
I
like
think
in Scotland, let's say Scotland?
Well,
I heard the Scottish Prime Minister last week and she said they should, we did it with the London government. We sat down and talked about Scottish in 97, or with Ireland in 1999, or Wales in 1996. So I think...
No, obviously, yeah, you're right. No, independence is not the only solution. A referendum on independence.
No, but the question would be independence, self-government, or current situation, like in Scotland. I had checked to Scotland because I know.
Yeah, well, in 2014 it was yes or no to independence.
No, I'm talking about in 1999.
And then, yes, obviously, back then the option was devolution, yes or no.
In Scotland, yes.
Yeah. So, now I truly believe that the referendum should be yes or no to independence. And then, if the answer is no, then you probably need another round of voting or decisions on what else can be the solution. It is not independence. But at the point we arrived, where we feel, and we who support independence feel, that we are held within Spain through force, through jailing of our leaders, through threatening us. I mean, I just said I had to stop the conversation because I only speak for myself, and obviously it is not the norm of a democracy to blame others for what I said, obviously, and those who are being tried in Madrid, I understand they are being judged by what they did in October 2017, not about what I'm saying here today. But to go back to your question, I really think that in this situation, because there is no link of consent between Catalonia and the majority of Catalans and the Constitution of Spain and the constitutional system of Spain, it is necessary to have a referendum on whether the majority of Catalans want to belong to Spain or not in the first place. So we need to, before we can have a new social contract, we need to decide whether we want to have a contract at all.
This is going, so this is slightly different from what I was originally going to ask. But it comes to some degree from a bit of a sore spot I have. I'm a historian. I teach here at the University of Helsinki in economic and social history. I'm also a Catalan. Pay no attention to my accent. And there are a few things I want to observe, all of which I think stem from ultimately what I think is kind of the problem at the center of all of this, and I'm curious if you agree, and that is an insufficient attention to historical contingency. That is to say, the specificity at particular times, particular historical circumstances. And the comments that happened a little bit earlier, I think are a good example of this. So for instance, when people bring up 1714, and I don't want to linger on that because I think that's actually a bit of a trap, right? It's a narrative that doesn't contribute to the conversation. But the 1714 story about the Catalans siding with the Habsburg candidate,
This tends to ignore the fact that the French side was liberal in a very centralizing fashion. And in this sense, the conservatism of the Habsburg candidate, and I can recommend the work, the excellent work of Luis Corteguera, a historian in the United States for this, was in this sense better for Catalan regional autonomy, in as much as the traditional solution was a more federated, more devolved situation, where the Corona de Aragon ran its affairs and Catalonia within the Corona de Aragon ran its affairs less directly from Madrid and more on its own terms. But more importantly and more germanely, 1978. I think the people who are using, and I do think historical contingency cuts both ways, and my original question was, but you sort of answered it already, was to what degree is this all informed by the legacies, the political discursive legacies of Franquismo, right? I'm a historian of Francoism, so of course my head went there. But 1978 is a particular moment with particular pressures. Nobody wanted a civil war, right? Nobody wanted to return to those kinds of divisions. Everybody wanted to move on from Francoism. 2019 is not 1978. Right? We don't need a constitution for 1978, we need a constitution for 2019. So to some degree, dwelling on history, and again, it's strange for a historian to say this, but nevertheless, dwelling on 1978 and on Francoism as an argument against autonomy right now, or in self-determination right now, strikes me as being not very helpful because our circumstances are different, except for when they aren't. And that's what I'm curious to hear more about, which is, to what degree do you think the political discourse, particularly of the Spanish state, and attitudes toward the primacy of legality over the social contract, todo atado y bien atado, as opposed to individuals being able to express democratic opinions as long as it doesn't injure other people's democratic rights, is taking primacy. To what degree are we dealing, this is not a perfect contrast, but to what degree are we dealing with a Hobbesian versus Lockean logic here still? Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the question. I'm always very reluctant to use history as an argument, because the problem we have is the problem we have in 2019, and I think I really will use that idea that you used before, that we need a constitution for 2019, not for 1978. I think that's a really good point, that we don't need to see how many people voted this constitution in 1978. The real question is how many people would vote for it today. I think the answer is quite obvious. We know the opinion polls, but we know that a majority of Catalans would not support this constitution today, and that goes well beyond the spectrum of pro-independence people. So that's a very good point. And the historical points that I made were not related to an essentialist vision of the nation, and whether that was a civil war within Spain between two different versions of Spain and not a Catalan Spanish. It just doesn't matter. I'm just trying to explain that the Spanish modern state was the result of a war in which some people won and some people lost. And obviously those who lost the war are more likely to be unhappy with the political system that was born at the time. And if the situation goes on and there's another war in which you are on the losing side again, then that only reinforces the idea that Spain is a very unique political system in the sense that it's traditionally been unable to find a consensus over the political system. And yes, there's a very unique moment in 1978 when we managed to draft a constitution that was supported by the people, and that's a new argument that I would present to the first question, is that that consensus was possible because the more intractable issues were left out of the constitution. So it was a misleading consensus based on ignoring the real problems and deferring the real problems to non-constitutional legislation. So in that sense, the idea is that we do need a political settlement for 2019 and not for not a previous one. And in that sense, it is irrelevant what happened in 1714. There's only one point that I often make about 1714, is that only because 1714 existed, you can understand that there's never been a Spanish president or prime minister from Catalonia in normal times. Never. There's only the leaders of the First Republic that failed as revolutionaries and ended up killed or in exile. And that tells you something about Spain. The fact, I think that part of the country that is more than 15% of the population never produced anyone ready to be the Spanish prime minister or president tells you something about the nature of this state. And it's not only that the president or the prime minister of Spain is also the president of the Supreme Court. Throughout history, in 200 years of history of the Spanish Supreme Court, there's never been a Catalan president of the Supreme Court, presiding judge of the Supreme Court from Catalonia. So that tells you something about this country, I think. And I'm only mentioning this because, interestingly enough, the Supreme Court of Canada, when dealing with Quebec and trying to justify that Quebec did not have the right to self-determination, used the argument that the Canadian Prime Minister was Quebecer, the Canadian leader of the opposition was Quebecer, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was a Quebecer, and the etc., etc., etc. So I said, well, that's not exactly like in Spain. Oh, sorry.
Well, first of all, thank you for the lecture. I'm also from Spain, I'm not from Catalonia, but I would really like to say that in opposite what that you have said, it's not a problem only about Catalonia, it is clearly a conflict in Spain. I am from Valencia, where we also speak Catalan, and we don't feel like we are living in a very democratic country. I'm not saying it's not. I'm talking about feelings, because it's very unlikely to find a Catalan speaker in Valencia who hasn't had problems in the normal life to express ourselves, because we try to speak in Catalan, but we cannot, as we have a lot of repression from the Spanish government, during all the democracy actually, because Spain has been always afraid that Valencia is going to be as Catalonia somehow. We were watching TV, I remember some years ago, we were watching the only TV we had in Catalan, in our language, only one TV, and I don't know, 30 or 40 channels in Spanish, and only one in Catalan, and still the Spanish government was not happy with that situation, and one day we were watching the TV and the TV was closed, because they didn't allow us to watch the TV in Catalan. Also, we have tried to have in more Catalan in the schools, and the Valencian government and the Spanish government has forbidden that. So we are not living in a normal situation in Spain at all, and it's so clear. And it's not only Valencia, it's also in the Basque Country. They will have also problems in how to fit in Spain. So it's not only a thing about Catalonia, it's a thing about democracy. And there is a lot of people that when we see that the Spanish, Catalan politicians are fighting to have a referendum, we are not seeing only that you are willing to have the independence or not, but you are also working to have a more democratic Spain where people can express themselves. So it's not only a problem inside Catalonia, it's a general problem, and Spain should find a way to fit in, to try to fit that multicultural reality in one state. And related to this, I would like to ask you if you think there is still a chance, or a small chance to find a way to fit inside Spain, if Spain will offer different situations, or now the point is past due to what recently has happened?
Well, I think I agree on what you said, that there is a general problem about how Spain deals with cultural diversity, and this is not a problem that only Spain has. This is a common problem of multinational states and multi-ethnic states. It's happened before around the world, and people in Quebec, a lot of people in Quebec want independence from Canada because they think that the majority of Canadians don't respect their cultural identity, and the people in Scotland want to a separate country from the UK for similar reasons. So this is not unique about Spain. The fact that there is cultural diversity, that there is political diversity, and people have different views. I think what's unique here is the response that Spain is giving to the problem. Because in Canada, they allow the Quebecers to vote. In the UK, the government even agreed on the rules of the referendum. And in Spain, and I will use this question to go back to something that I missed on your side. This is this idea of legality against democracy, this value, that this sort of a moral value that is given to the law, which is, I think, unique, and it probably has something to do with the experience under the dictatorship with Franco. I always say that under dictatorship you do have laws. The difference between a dictatorship and a democracy is not that you have a legal system, that you have laws, that you have the rule of law or something similar, that you have courts. That's not what distinguishes a democracy from a dictatorship. What distinguishes a democracy from a dictatorship is that the laws are consistent with the will of the people, and that the laws are changed every time the people want to change them. That's what distinguishes a democracy from a dictatorship. So yes, this sacred nature of the laws, I don't think is something you can find in old democracies. And here in Finland, I mean, in Spain, I haven't said much about the Constitutional Court and the problems that having the Constitutional Court like a police body against politicians is behind all the problems that we had. And it's, I just wanted to point out that I would, maybe we would be better off if we were like Finland, where there's no constitutional court. Probably in the UK, the fact that there's no constitutional court and there's no constitution. But just let me make a point about this. The difference between the UK and Spain is not that the UK does not have a constitution and Spain does have a constitution that can be amended realistically. That's not really the difference, because the Scottish referendum was not possible under UK law either. So the UK government could have said to the Scottish government, no, you can't have a referendum on independence because the law does not allow this referendum to be called and to happen. But the answer was different. Was we will change the law. And actually, that's what happened. And the UK government passed legislation, specific legislation, to transfer the powers to the Scottish government to call the referendum. So the difference between Spain and the UK is not a constitutional difference, it's a political difference. It's the fact that not the majority, but all of the members of the House of Commons of the UK and all of the members of the House of Lords consented to the legislation that allowed the referendum in Scotland. So if the same situation happened in Spain, that all the members of the Spanish Congress and all the members of the Spanish Senate gave their consent to having a referendum in Catalonia, it would be possible. So the difference is it's somewhere else. Maybe he, because he didn't speak.
Very quickly. We are.
I think we're out of time, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I am from Basque Country, and I would like to know, like, after 1st October, Basque government spoke about a mutual relationship to try to help each other. I would like to know if ever has been, or actually it is this kind of relationship, how can each one improve or both manage?
Well, that's a very tricky question. I think the experience in October 2017 was not a successful experience. And now I think we learned that obviously there's much sympathy in the Basque Country for Catalonia and the other way around for the political situations. But I think the role of a mediator that we desperately need cannot come from the Basque Country for the reasons that were at least demonstrated in 2017. So I think we learned that at the time, and we should improve our relationship. I think I'm very much in favor of my political group, like joining forces with other Basque groups to push a real change in the situation of Spain that would allow for a political solution and for the exercise of the right of self-determination in Catalonia, and also in the Basque Country if the majority so chooses. But unfortunately, I think we're not in sync for some reasons. So the Basque Country and Catalonia, for some reason, have different cycles, political cycles, and there was this huge conflict 15 years ago with the plans to amend the Basque State of Autonomy and the idea to call a public consultation the future of the Basque Country, etc. And that also had a similar reaction from the Spanish government at the time, which was to try to jail Belén Cario, the Basque president. So, in a sense, it all goes back to this legalism, no? So this idea that the law is above everything, and to go back to the beginning of my speech with a philosophical question that I used to ask my students in political theory classes, which is basically, why should we obey the laws? What's the moral value of the laws? Why are they binding? Why should society be governed by a given law and not a different one? Who gave us those laws? I'm not going to give the answer, but I'm just saying that the normal answer, the answer that the majority will give to that question in political theory and political philosophy is the social contract. Right? And so if you don't have a social contract, what's the value of the law? And I would say none. The law has no value unless there is a working social contract and a democratic decision to establish those laws, to abide by those laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you for attending and all the good questions. Have a nice day.